Hi, everybody. I'm Violet, and welcome to my capstone presentation, Detached from Détaché, Availability of Orchestra Programs in a Subset of Public Arizona District Schools. So what is an orchestra program? So it's instruction in the bowed string family. That's violin, viola, cello, and double bass, as you see here. They're also known as string programs, string education. I'll be referring to orchestra in these ways as well throughout the presentation. And it's one of three main music performance ensembles found in schools in the United States. So that's orchestra. Why is orchestra important? Well, the truth is that a school orchestra curriculum is incomplete without it because orchestra affords you the unique opportunity to perform works, some of the greatest works by some of history's greatest composers. I think that's really its value. Unfortunately, for some reason, even though orchestra has a long history in American public schools going all the way back to the 1800s, and it's one of the three main music ensembles, like I mentioned, it's the least commonly offered, and even where it is offered, its enrollment numbers are far fewer than band or choir. Sadly, it's typically found in large, suburban, high-income, majority white schools. That's been the case for decades, although recent research is coming out at the individual state level that might buck some of those trends, as we'll see. But so I grew up detached from détaché. I made a pun to describe my experiences. Can't believe nobody else has used this pun who's been researching the subject, but like, because it seems so obvious. But détaché, the French word for the basic back and forth bow stroke. So if you imagine miming the violin, miming playing the violin, that's détaché. So I grew up detached from that because I grew up in the West Valley and my public schools did not offer orchestra. As I was a public school student from 23 to 2010, I noticed that when I encountered string players, that they typically came from the East Valley, and I thought that was unusual. Well, not unusual. I just feel like I missed out by not being able to experience orchestra until well into college. So I became interested in this topic. Actually, I've been interested in this topic for the past 16 years, and I finally got a chance to investigate it. So I wanted to know, are there really more string programs in the East Valley public schools and districts than in the West Valley? And where exactly do public school students get the opportunity to participate in orchestra in Arizona? So I'll go through the spatial data sets that enabled me to answer some of these questions. So here's the schools that I examined. I looked at elementary, middle, and high schools. I focused on traditional public schools, and I didn't have time to look at every school from every district. So here's a map. You can see that they're mostly clustered around the Phoenix and Tucson metropolitan areas. So I decided to focus on those two areas as well as the state level. So here's the Phoenix Mesa Chandler Metropolitan Statistical Area, and it consists of Maricopa and Pima counties. I have the incorporated city boundaries in green, and then the census designated places in purple. So it's and I have some of the labels reflecting the populations, at least for the incorporated cities, but not for the census designated places because they didn't have any pop values to use. Here's Tucson, and I was surprised to learn that the Tucson Metropolitan Statistical Area includes Pima County. So I'm not showing all of Pima County because the western portion of it, there weren't any census designated places out there. But you can see the Tucson metro area, and then there's some other communities out here. So I focused on those areas. Here's my school districts that I looked at. You see the unified districts in light blue and the elementary districts in dark blue. The hashes represent districts that I didn't where none of the schools in my data set were in those districts, either because there weren't any population or the school got filtered out, as I'll explain. Here's my Union High School district. So there are only 14 of these that I looked at, and they're actually aggregations of elementary school districts. So if I were to overlay, you would see the elementary school districts that make up each Union High School district. And so I'm not going to dwell much on this, but I talk about it extensively in my paper. I downloaded two tabular data sets, one about enrollment demographics, that would be majority race at each school. And then I also looked at free and reduced price lunch percentages, the percentage of students at each campus that are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, because free and reduced price lunch has been a socioeconomic metric used in education research for a long time. And so here's my workflow flow chart. It consisted mainly of getting and cleaning data, doing tabular joins, and then spatial joins, filtering some schools based on definition queries, Then I will say that the part that took longest was adding the values for orchestra offerings, because I had to look at each and every individual school and district website and manually enter those values, and it took a long time. But I finally got through it, and I was able to create some interesting visualizations. So here are my results. So this is my bivariate graduated symbol map. So you can see I put a transparency on the elementary and unified districts, and the circle size represents the number of schools from the districts that I looked at. So like, for example, Tucson Unified has a big circle because there were a lot of schools, whereas other districts, maybe that might have been one school I looked at. It just depended on what was in the data set. And as you can see, the intensity of the colors, so the dark pink represents the districts that had the highest percentage of their schools offering orchestra. You can see right away that the East Valley of Metro Phoenix dominates this. Um, that's where I found the highest percentages, sometimes as high as 100% of the schools I looked at offered orchestra. But something I thought was surprising was Tucson had a really high, let's say the Tucson metro area had a really high percentage of orchestra offerings as well, which I'll talk about in just a sec. But here was the unified high schools. So even though you see Phoenix right in the center, even though I surveyed the most schools, let's say the most unified high schools from Phoenix, Glendale Union, Tempe Union, Yuma, all had higher percentages of schools offering orchestra. And unfortunately, my graduated symbol maps were really confusing when you zoom in, because the geographic expanse of the school districts does not reflect the cities, let's say, that they get their names from. So you can see way out in southwestern Arizona, here's Yuma, that's Yuma Union High School District. So it's big. And so unless you know what you're looking at, you might be able to recognize the shapes of the cities or the places, but recognizing the shapes of the districts is a lot harder with all the labels turned on. And then when I turned on the labels, it just became chaos. So I left them off to focus on the graduated symbols. I created this other visualization just to see the distributions. This helped me make more sense of this. So I put a transparency on that same incorporated city boundaries and the census designated places. So as you can see, East Valley, really high representation of orchestra, a lot fewer out west where I grew up and attended school, and then fewer in like South Phoenix here you see, but there is some high orchestra representations in the, let's say, higher affluent, higher income areas of the North Valley here, like Paradise Valley and Scottsdale. Less if you go further down, like down here in Casa Grande, way down at the bottom, kind of a little bit in Maricopa, just north of it. So I made that visual, and here's Tucson, which I thought was the most interesting. I was so surprised by the number of orchestra offerings in Tucson, the surrounding communities like Marana and Vail and the Catalina foothills, for instance. But if you look closely, you can see that South Tucson still has fewer representation of orchestra programs. If you can see it just barely in this map. And I don't know if the high number of orchestra programs in Tucson was indicative of a problem with my data collection or not. Unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with Tucson's geography as I am Maricopa County, where I grew up and have lived most of my life. So let's just say I was surprised and like thought this was super interesting and wanted to know like why is Tucson have such a high representation of orchestra, whereas the West Valley does not? And all I can do is speculate based on what other researchers have found. Overall, my findings still support previous research about the demographics of schools with orchestras. My data set indicated that orchestra was mostly found in large suburban high-income schools, but the most orchestra programs were found on Hispanic majority campuses, and I thought that was interesting. That's in counter to previous research, with the exception of a recent study out of Texas, which also I think has similar demographics as Arizona. Unfortunately, gathering the data took so long that I didn't have time to analyze it any further, take it any further than where these school districts and schools were that had it and didn't. And so all I can do is speculate why some schools had it and why some schools don't. And I think a lot of it has to do with property taxes because a lot of our schools are funded through property taxes. So if you have higher property values, you're going to be getting more income for your school, let's say. And I think that would explain it. But unfortunately, property tax data sets aren't publicly available and they're expensive. If you were wanting to attain one, you'd have to pay at least a couple $100s from what I saw, even into the thousand, let's say. So I didn't want to pay for a data set I wasn't going to have time to use. But another thing, there was a study out of Oregon that indicated the importance of a district arts admin on whether a district would offer orchestra or not. And I noticed that Mesa Unified had one of the highest district percentages of schools offering orchestra. I think it was 100%. And not only does it have district arts admins, multiple district arts admins, but it has an orchestra specific admin. So I thought that was interesting. Previous research has also indicated staffing issues like inability to find qualified teachers because there aren't very many string players out there, along with scheduling conflicts, and even just a lack of interest or just maybe orchestra is not valued in those communities. But like I said, all I can do is really speculate at this point. And something else I noticed was I would love to see more GIS research in the field of music ed and education in general, because I feel like it can yield some really insightful things. And I'm glad I got the opportunity to answer one of the questions that I've had for the past 16 years about my experiences, growing up where there wasn't any orchestra programs. So I would love to see more GIS related research in the field of music ed and education as a whole. And so now I guess I'll turn it over to you guys. And do you guys have any questions for me?